In his 1972 book, Ways of Seeing, John Berger spends a few pages talking about the historical and critical reception of one painting by artist Franz Hals. The painting, titled Regents of the Old Men's Almshouse, is a striking one. Produced in the final years of Hals's life, he was by this point old and destitute. Living off of public charity, he was now commissioned to paint the administrators of such a charity. There's a certain cynicism that we can feel as we look at this painting. The subjects appear uncaring and spacey. This man stares off into the distance with a totally apathetic look on his face. This one seems numb, as though he may be drunk. So, Berger presents this painting and then goes on to introduce what an art historian says about it. According to this expert, there is no evidence that Hals painted this image with a spirit of bitterness. The composition is beautiful and harmonic. This man isn't drunk. The regents would have found the painting unacceptable if one of them was shown to be drunk. And besides, there's good medical reason to think that this subject suffers from facial paralysis, that's the reason he looks the way he does. So, John Berger looks at this historian's account, and his reaction is like, doesn't this kinda suck? From his perspective, it's silly to use this set of esoteric historical facts to distance us from the very way that we connect with and understand this painting. Looking at this image, we can see something. We can see a gesture toward darkness, a feeling that all is not well in this picture. As Berger puts it, Hals was the first portraitist to paint the new characters and expressions created by capitalism. And why would we let some historian who knows some medical thing take that moment of interpretation away from us? Anyway, Berger calls this practice cultural mystification, the process of explaining away what might otherwise be evident. And when I think about Elliot Rodger and the way his story was treated, cultural mystification is what I think of. Elliot Rodger was a murderer. On May 23, 2014, he killed 6 people near the University of California, Santa Barbara, as well as himself. And when I look at his crimes, what I see is a story about terrible beliefs taken to an awful conclusion. Elliot Rodger wrote a manifesto called My Twisted World, made a series of YouTube videos where he put forth extremely misogynistic views. To him, women were subhuman, incapable of choosing mates properly, deserving of extreme violence because they didn't want to have sex with him. He was also a white supremacist. He hated black people and saw himself as superior because he was half white, descended from British aristocracy. He was also obsessed with class and money. To him, it was his breeding and his material possessions that set him apart from these less deserving men. He was the supreme gentleman with a nice car and expensive sunglasses. Punctuating all of these elements, though, is a sharp sense of Elliot Rodger's feelings of inadequacy. Sure, he thought girls were the worst, but he didn't know why they weren't interested in him. Sure, he was half white, but he was half Asian too. Sure, he had some nice stuff, but he needed more. He was obsessed with winning the lottery. And to me, this is most of what Elliot Rodger is. A man with a complicated and awful ideological perspective who committed a crime that aligned with that perspective. And looking at him, what I'd want to ask is, what does he tell us? His writings, his beliefs, his actions, his politics, what do they say? On May 26, 2013, only 3 days after the massacre, Stefan Molyneux made a video called The Truth About Elliot Rodger. And right off the bat, he has a real bone to pick with those kinds of questions. In the first moments of his video, he tells us, there are all sorts of people out there who are gonna try to read into Elliot Rodger to make this about some big political issue, feminism, or whatever. And this act, to Stefan, is disrespectful and opportunistic.
A lot of people tragically attempt to climb over the bodies of the victims of these kinds of shooters and unfurl whatever particular political or socioeconomic flag they wish to unfurl, which I consider highly disrespectful to the victims. They're not tools to be used in a political agenda. whether it's feminism, anti-misogyny, or gun rights, or you name it.
So instead of doing that, he wants to approach this tragedy specifically. Look at the nitty-gritty of Elliot Rodger's life, look at the events he describes in his manifesto, and come to various evidenced conclusions on why and how these murders happened.
These victims deserve as much understanding and analysis, rational analysis, that we can bring to the problem in the hopes of preventing recurrence.
So, on first blush, it kind of feels like Stefan Molyneux's agenda is just a lot better than mine is. I mean, look, the most important thing about Elliot Rodger is not that he was a misogynist or a white supremacist or anything like that. It's that he murdered people. If he didn't do that, I wouldn't even know who the guy was. So it only stands to reason that our only way of looking at this person should work to explain his crime. That is how we can learn from this awful tragedy and prevent such things from happening in the future. Big Joel's loosey-goosey political power hour be damned. Well, I don't agree with that. I don't think Stefan Molyneux's paradigm works. And to show you why, I want to talk about his video. So, broadly speaking, the truth about Elliot Rodger is a story about collecting straws. And I mean that kinda literally. Stefan says that phrase just so many times.
I'm not blaming video games. Hundreds of millions of video game players around the world, they don't become shooters. But again, we're looking at the straws on the camel's back. It's all over the LA scene. That beautiful women go there to milk money and status out of their beauty. So again, this is part of the culture that he lived in. Again, I'm not saying it's causal, but it is another one of the straws on the camel's back. Now, I'm not even remotely, of course, trying to suggest that divorce causes mass murder, because there are hundreds of millions of children of divorce around the world, and very few of them will ever become mass murderers. But we're looking at the number of straws on the camel's back.
Most of the video is spent going through Elliot Rodger's manifesto and finding various things in his life that probably, at least according to Steph, contributed to his murdering people. Not claiming that any one of these were the proximate cause of the murders, but that all of them contributed in some way. And there are a legitimately shocking number of these reasons. Video games, his parents divorcing, his first experience with masturbation, his going to different schools, violent movies, his father being too ambitious, and the list goes on and on. Now, all this does make for a strikingly repetitive and monotonous video. Just reading a few lines of the manifesto and blandly adding another straw to the camel's back ad nauseum.
I then started to notice that all the cool kids were interested in skateboarding. I had never even ridden on a skateboard before, but if I wanted to be cool, I had to become a skateboarder. This was the start of an obsession to copy everything that the supposed cool kids were doing. This cool element is an absolutely leprous cancer in the heart of society, and was responsible for massive amounts of bullying and suicidality and rage and violence. Cool is not virtuous.
But it's not hard to see why the video is this way. If you're only looking for the path that leads Elliot Rodger to becoming Elliot Rodger, and if you want to avoid a systemic critique as much as possible, it only makes sense to go scattershot, to explore every possible avenue of meaning to figure out what exactly went wrong here. And although that seems kind of reasonable, we can see how this line of reasoning might lead us into a bit of an ethical trap. Specifically, the inability to figure out which actions we want to judge. See, even as we want to prevent mass murderers from coming into existence, this desire can't meaningfully permeate all of the things we do in our day-to-day lives. For instance, did every woman who chose not to have sex with Elliot Rodger contribute to his decision to murder people? I mean, come on, I'm not saying I know that's related to why he committed his crimes, but it might be another straw on the camel's back, right? Well, no, that's repulsive. I felt gross just saying it, and I wouldn't have said it except it comes up later. We can't allow our fear of potential Elliot Rodgers to hold us hostage, to make us arrange our lives and our societies in ways that we know to be unacceptable. And at the very least, the tiny risk that some unhappy virgin will start killing people will always be too small and too unimportant to trump our fundamental desire to use our bodies the way we want to. So, looking at the life and manifesto of Elliot Rodger, we can't just point to every event that happened to him and say, don't do that, 'cause just look what happened. It's far too narrow. Instead, we can only judge and advise against those actions that are themselves harmful, that do or transparently lead to obvious damage. But here's the thing. Stefan Molyneux actually sidesteps this problem, and he does so by implicitly claiming one of the strangest things imaginable. What if basically everything that ever happened to Elliot Rodger was bad? What if all of his experiences deserve judgment because they are all harmful or maladaptive or wrong, particularly those things related to his upbringing? Like, look at how Stefan talks about Elliot's first experience going to school.
So Elliot goes on to say, I was forced to wear a uniform, which I hated because I had to wear uncomfortable socks up to my knees. I was very nervous and cried on my first day there. I didn't like school at Dorset House very much.
Now, reading this part of the manifesto, I might say, sure, that's hard. And when I was a kid, I cried the first time I went to school and wanted to see my mom again. But that's normal, right? The difficulty of growing up. But to Stefan, no. You should listen to your child, and to do otherwise is appalling parenting.
So this is important. There's a certain ethic or approach to parenting, which goes along the lines of, well, I know what's best for you, and therefore I don't have to listen to what you don't like. I consider this appalling parenting. Appalling parenting, you listen to the child. If the child is crying and doesn't want to go away to school, then that is something you need to take into account. Doesn't mean you have to indulge your child's every whim. It's not sort of one extreme to the other, but these are important things to listen to with regards to your children.
And sure, he goes out of his way to say that he's not claiming we should indulge our child's every whim, but it's hard to see another takeaway from his position here. I mean, all Elliot wrote was that he had to go to a school he didn't like. The reactions of his parents to this information aren't even mentioned. So, what did these people do wrong? Not be compassionate enough? Not take their kids out of this school? I don't know. Stefan doesn't tell us. But it's something, right? They acted poorly in some way. Or later on, Stefan looks at a place in Elliot's manifesto where he discusses masturbating and having sexual fantasies that he didn't talk about with his parents.
In fact, I didn't talk to my parents at all about my sexual development. I felt too guilty and embarrassed about it. Whenever they probed me, I lied to them, telling them that I had no sex drive. My mother once caught me looking at pictures of girls online, and I frantically had to convince her that I stumbled on those pictures by accident.
And of course, when I read this, I'm like, yeah, of course he had those fantasies. Of course he lied about them to his parents. And I'm not saying we should shame sexual desire among teenagers, but that doesn't mean you have to talk about that stuff with your mom. It can be embarrassing and weird, and I know I acted that way with my mother and continue that wonderful tradition to this very day. But to Stefan, this is evidence of some big pattern of isolation.
You can't start talking with your kids when they're 15. You have to have the conversation. I started chatting with my daughter when she was still in her mother's womb, for heaven's sakes. You have to have conversations that go on for years before you can talk about the difficult things. You need to talk about the easy things. You can't just jump in the deep end without having that connection with your children.
You have to talk to your kids. Start off early with the easy stuff so that later on you can get to the somehow desirable point where you're exchanging sexual fantasies with the people who birthed you. Again, this passage of the manifesto somehow works as evidence that there was bad behavior on the part of these parents. And these examples get even more ridiculous and threadbare somehow. Elliot's mother making him attend camp.
At 11 years old, he writes, I was enjoying a lovely summer, but suddenly my mother said that I had to go to summer camp. I didn't like this one bit. It was a last-minute decision. One moment I was relaxing and enjoying my summer break. The next, my mother is waking me up early to take me to my first day of camp.
Stefan assumes that she did this with no warning. Another example of Elliot's parents not preparing him in the ways that they should have.
And again, we see this can't trust, can't relax, is not prepared for things, is not aware of what's coming down the road. Everything is bam, bam, just comes in out of nowhere.
But for one, there is no textual evidence that their sending him to this camp was this sudden. Sure, he says it was a bit last minute, but he makes it clear that his parents explained their rationale for this decision before the day he had to wake up early. This was a decision she made with my father because they thought it would be healthy for me. What an awful mom.
Both his stepmother and his mother are very attractive women and are cold and cruel, at least the stepmother is, by his report. He doesn't say much about his mother, but his mother did just wake him up out of nowhere and say, you're going to camp.
But more importantly, Elliot writes about enjoying his time at the camps he went to. In both of the other two sections where he talks about camp, he describes being unhappy at first, but then growing to enjoy it, playing games, watching movies, making friends. And what sets this particular camp experience apart is specifically that he had his first bad experience with a girl. So why are we judging these parents for sending their kid to a place that they knew him to enjoy? It's ridiculous on the face of it. His stepmom having some tasteful nudes online.
I'm not going to reproduce the pictures here, but on the father's, on Peter Rodger's website, there are endless pictures of his naked wife's butt.
Remember when I was saying our claim to our bodies and our sexualities must be seen as a moral priority? Well, Stefan has no such compunction.
You know your father's name, you go on and look at pictures, and then you can basically see your mother's butt and half a vagina hanging out, and that is, I think, fairly disturbing and indicates, what kind of woman would allow for that to happen.
Listen to his tone, how disgusted he is at this woman.
Recently, Pamela Anderson, who has been a professional sexpot, revealed a history of sexual abuse. Could that be the case with Sumaya? It's hard to know, but it certainly would fit.
How he assumes that Elliot was disturbed by this, even though he never once talked about it in his tell-all manifesto about his sexual anxiety. Who cares about any of that? Stefan has decreed that it's bad to have artsy nudes and stepchildren at the same time. So let's pop another straw on that back. And I could give you more examples of this. I promise I could, but I think you see the point. And honestly, looking at Stefan's gesture here, his desire to explain the nightmare of Elliot Rodger with a series of moral failings, I do feel some sympathy. Who doesn't feel the temptation to solve this puzzle, to find a solution and understand step by step how this event occurred and how we might prevent it from occurring again? But the cost is too high and too absurd. To treat every mundane and normal event as something worthy of our condemnation, to locate evil in every moment of Elliot's life, is to pathologize life itself, to render all of our actions disgusting and immoral. That is the only way to explain this tragedy. And even if we took this raw deal, accepted that all of the events in Elliot Rodger's life, even the seemingly average ones, were secretly terrible and harmful, is this a meaningful explanation of his crimes? Have we gotten our answers here that we want so badly? I don't think so. To me, it just obfuscates any sense of agency that Elliot Rodger had in all of this. See, the thing about a camel and the straw that breaks its back is that the output of the situation is a necessary function of the input. Camels can only bear so much weight, and if you keep adding more and more straws, that camel's eventually gonna pop. And while that might be unfortunate, it is predictable, a natural property of straws and camels' backs. Can we say the same thing about Elliot Rodger? Were his murders the natural output of his love of World of Warcraft, his father's ambition, his parents not preparing him for camp, his stepmom having some crunchy nudes on the internet? Do these events even count as straws? Well, in one sense, maybe. I mean, who knows if we have free will? Who knows what those words even mean? And perhaps Elliot was just a function of his experiences, bound to murder those people in the same way that I'm bound to make this video. But come on, we can't live like this. We must be able to be decent, to live moral lives. And no matter what Elliot experienced, good or bad, we must be able to look at his crimes and say, that was wrong. You had no good reason for doing that, and it wasn't the straws that did it. It was you. And look, I'm not saying that there is no use for Stefan's form of investigation. While I do think Stefan Molyneux is a pseudoscientific quack with mommy issues who's totally incapable of producing anything of meaning, this sort of highly specific psychological perspective can be interesting and telling, but such an analysis can't be the end to this story, and any attempt we make to draw some elaborate causal map of Elliot Rodger's life, to understand why he did what he did in some perfectly determined way, will never be successful or adequate. At the end of the day, Elliot Rodger may have been the victim of something, if not his parents or the world around him, then of the machinations of his own mind. But we don't need to feel pity for him, or to try to explain his actions with a million meaningless straws, because he was a monster, and he is dead, and nothing remains of him. That is, except for one thing, his beliefs, his politics, his art. And don't kid yourself, Elliot Rodger's art is vital. I don't think we have to argue against him like he's espousing some coherent political ideology. I'd actually recommend not doing that. But we should recognize that we can see his ideas reflected back at us in a million places. Most obviously, we have the incel community. Even during Elliot Rodger's life, this community started gaining traction on forums like PUA Hate. But it's only grown since then. And these guys idolize Elliot Rodger, fundamentally think he made a lot of good points. They seem to share Elliot's political cognitive dissonance concerning women, as they simultaneously recognize them of people depriving them of the greatest pleasure known to man, sex and love, and as robotic and opportunistic subhumans, femoids. What's more, we can see Elliot's work in the actions of these guys. Since Elliot Rodger's manifesto and massacre, there have been 4 more mass murderers who literally cited him as an inspiration, a body count of 42 more people. And we don't even have to go to incels to see Elliot Rodger's ideology in our culture. No, we can just look at the guy who's talking to us, Stefan Molyneux. Like Elliot, Stefan is a white supremacist.
First of all, I've always been skeptical of the ideas of white nationalism, of identitarianism, and white identity. However, I am an empiricist, and I could not help but notice that I could have peaceful, free, easy, civilized, and safe discussions in what is essentially an all-white country.
Like Elliot, he thinks that women are often incapable of choosing their partners properly. He thinks that because of the modern dysfunctional structure of society, they're now incentivized to choose the poor, aggressive men instead of the richer, nicer, kinder ones.
And it really wasn't until the free market that nice guys got the edge. And then nice guys were getting the edge, competent guys were getting the edge, decent guys were getting the edge. And then the asshole said, okay, well, let's just swarm to the state, get a welfare state, and now we're back on top. Now women can go for jerks and aggressive people and so on. Because the guy who's really good at getting resources in a primitive society usually ends up, broke, poor, or in jail in a free society.
And like Elliot, he thinks that women have to be held accountable in some way.
All the cold-hearted jerks who run the world came out of the vaginas of women who married assholes. And I don't know how to make the world a better place without holding women accountable for choosing assholes. Your dad was an asshole because your mother chose him. Because it works on so many women.
Now, I'm not saying that Stefan is pro-mass murder or something like that, but his political connection with Elliot Rodger is undeniable. He fundamentally agrees with him on a wide variety of topics. In fact, their similarity is probably the reason why Stefan didn't want to talk about this stuff in the first place. After all, he feels no compunction politicizing these murders when he can somehow paint Elliot's crime as an example of racism against white people.
But his hatred was for blonde white girls. And that is as much a racial crime as it is a gender crime. The gender is the result of him being heterosexual and rejected by women, but the racial element is very specific. And if you can imagine, if a half white guy had targeted only black women, then this would be a racial hate crime.
Or when he claims that leftist politics were another straw on his back.
Leftism, egalitarianism, liberalism, socialism, communism, all of the evening out ideologies may perhaps play a role, a small role to be fair, in this idea that violence is perfectly acceptable in redistributing the goods of this world.
But when it comes to this being a crime of misogyny and white supremacy, actually being reflective of ideologies that real people have and disseminate to their massive audiences, nope, let's avoid politics there. And everything Elliot Rodger represents and writes about just spraying forth out of the ether, the random garblings of a madman with family problems, impossible to connect to anything in the real world. Just forget about that stuff. It's irrelevant, distasteful. So, Stefan Molyneux looks at this picture by Elliot Rodger, My Twisted World, and he tries to explain the picture with a series of esoteric facts. Elliot Rodger's disgusting beliefs and actions can be understood just by looking at his life, at his parents forcing him to do things, at World of Warcraft and violent video games, at stepmoms and their butts. And I understand why anyone might want to do this. Because once we have all this supposed information, the picture and its meanings can be determined, fixed down. This work doesn't mean what you think it means. Honestly, it doesn't mean much of anything. The manifesto is just the result of a bunch of tiny failures that added up, and that's all there is to it. But it's not these little moral tidbits that we see when we look at Elliot Rodger. It's not some collection of esoteric historical trivia. No, what we see is something meaningful. A person, his crimes, his ideology, his art. So, what does all that say to you? Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching my videos. I know this was a dark and kind of serious one, and I appreciate you staying with me until the end and all that. Thank you so much to my patrons, and now it's time for my Patreon question of the video. Little lighten mood time. Brett Dibble asks, what is the most outlandish thing that you enjoy as a topping on pizza? What? I don't enjoy any weird... What could I possibly say to that? A Snickers bar. Yeah, that's what I love. I love a big Snickers. The peanut melts into the cheese. Mwah. I don't know. Leave me alone. I regret doing this. Anyway, bye.